History laid the foundation
that informs our conversation. Welcome to the classroom.
From the church to the streets, and even in the suites, and all around the world. I'm gonna keep it real in the classroom.
Fannie Lou's classroom. Fannie Lou's classroom. Fannie Lou's classroom.
Episode 1 of Fannie Lou's Classroom. We are super duper excited to be launching this podcast today. But first, I have to give a major shout out to everyone who made this possible. I want to start with our very own senior pastor, the Reverend Dr. Frederick Douglass Haynes III. We want to give him a major applause. Can I get some applause? There we go. We want to thank him for his amazing ministry. We know it is rooted and grounded in justice, so it makes it possible for those of us on staff to really carry his vision. So he's not the only one out there with, he's not out there by himself. So we're super excited. And I'm excited to serve as the pastor of justice at Friendship West Baptist Church. And so obviously this podcast is near and dear to me in the entire justice ministry as we try to live out what it means to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God. I want to give a shout out to our communications team, Chris Norman, Jack O'Connor, and Albany Haynes, and our AV team, Snoop Robinson, Brooke, and Roche Moore. Y'all, Roche and Brooke are our engineers for the podcast. We are all female team here running Fannie Lou's Classroom, so I'm excited and blessed to have them here. So many gifted and talented people. We have Candace Lowe, who is our executive producer. We have Cheryl Prelow and Shanika Wilkerson, who are also a part of our team. So we're just excited to have this opportunity to come to you. So Fannie Lou's Classroom, we really want to launch this and start this as a way of having a conversation around theology and politics, this way in which our faith should intersect with public life. What does it mean for our faith to show up in the public square? So this podcast is designed to talk about current issues that are critically important to us, particularly Black communities, and what we can do to connect and engage and be a part of our own liberation. So it's about how do we engage in the political process, but also, what do we do in terms of community building? And so we have numerous guests who will come on who are experts, and some we're just going to have a conversation about what does it mean to talk about what's happening in our communities and what we can do to make things better. And so our first segment, we always start off with what's called Fannie's Class. And so we do this because Fannie Lou Hamer, in my opinion, was what people may call a practical theologian. And that is, Fannie Lou Hamer understood a very good understanding of who God was, who Jesus was, and faith in justice, as well as peace in justice and land in labor. She had a very well-developed theology that she lived out in the public square. So for her, theology had to be applicable to everyday life, and she did that beyond measure. So in Fannie's Class, what we do each week, we'll talk about either a Sankofa moment that will allow us to go back and to see what our ancestors did in order to help us to better understand how we move forward in the 21st century, or it just may be what's current, what's a topic that's going on currently in our nation that we want to give attention to, that you may go on to research for yourself and get connected and engaged. So it's just a short segment. We'll step into Fannie's Class to hear about something, and then we'll move on with our show and our amazing guests that we have today that I'll get to in a matter of moments. But now let's step into Fannie's Class.
In Fannie Lou's class. Now don't you dare be late. We need retention, not detention.
So what I want to talk about today in Fannie's Class, one of the things about Fannie Lou Hamer, yes, many people think of her as a civil rights leader, but really she was a human rights leader, right? Fannie Lou Hamer understood beyond what it meant to try to register to vote in Mississippi. And in 1964, the Democratic Convention of 1968, she boldly sat before the Credentials Committee and gave her testimony of the violence that was imputed on her because she dared to register to vote and would not remove her name from the roster. But what she did, and as she went to talk about what happened as she tried to register to vote. But for me, if you listen to this testimony, you can we'll have that link for you right in our YouTube description for you to check it out. But please listen to it, because as she talks about what happened to her as it relates to voting, she really shifted the conversation, and she really talked about, I question America. Is this not the land of the free and the home of the brave? Because we have to sleep with our telephones off the hook daily because our lives are threatened all because not we want to vote, but that we want to become first-class citizens. And so for me, what she did was it says, I'm not going to keep telling you I'm human. I know I'm human. I want to talk about what is it about America that's so violent that you don't honor my humanity. And so we think about Buffalo, we think about Texas, and just Tulsa, Oklahoma yesterday. We talk about gun violence, but really guns are just a tool in the toolbox. And so we have to think about America as a culture of death and violence. Because before the gun, it was the whip. Then it was the noose. Then it was the dogs, the water hoses, etc. Right? So it's this idea of this culture of death and violence that's really designed to maintain and control and hold power. And that happens physically, but also structurally. And I want to talk about structural violence today with our amazing guest that we have as we talk about our topic today of housing at the intersection of accessibility and affordability. And I'm excited for the two guests that we have on today. So first we have with us Reverend Edwin Robinson. So Reverend Edwin Robinson is a community organizer, a political consultant with a background in organizing Black people and people of faith to develop life-giving policies, elect progressive leaders, and build the civic and revolutionary power of ordinary people like himself. I'm going to read that again. To build civic and revolutionary power. That is doing something different that brings about a significant change of ordinary people like himself. Edwin believes that through leadership of those who have been made to be the least of these, that we can dismantle systems of oppression that continue to create the poor and powerless among us. Let's welcome Reverend Edwin Robinson to Fannie Lou's classroom. And then we have Councilman Casey Thomas. As Dallas City Council member of District 3, Casey was elected by his peers to serve in Mayor Pro Tem in 2018. He currently serves as chair of the Housing and Homeless Solutions Committee, where he will lead the council through a racial equity audit of the city's first comprehensive housing policy. He also will lead the city's efforts in the collaboration Dallas Real-Time Housing with the goal to cut the homeless population in half in the next 2 years. I'm going to read that again. With the goal to cut the homeless population in half in the next 2 years. And that's going to be critically important as we get into our conversation. He has an extensive list of service where he also serves as vice chair of Workforce Education and Equity Committee. He serves as the Public Safety Committee, and he was recently appointed as vice chair of the REAL, which stands for Racial Equity and Leadership Council for the National League of Cities. So welcome Councilman Casey Thomas to Fannie Lou's classroom as well. I'm excited to have both of them with us. So I read the bio. I did the professional thing, but I also want to say I know these two men, right, just as friends, as brothers, and particularly brothers in the movement. I've known Casey for over 20 years. We dating ourselves. We met each other back in the day in the streets, and we were early in our 20s. So, and Brother Edwin, I think I met you maybe about 10 years ago, maybe. Probably
6, 8,
maybe something like that.
Yeah.
But, we done hooked up, so it's like I've known him longer than that. But I just want to say thank you to both of you for accepting this invitation to be a part of Fannie Lou's Classroom and the first guest on Fannie Lou's Classroom for what I think is a very critical topic for Black communities, right? Mm-hmm. So even if we're talking about the lack of being able to afford homes from the 50s to 60s and wealth being stripped from us, from owning home ownership to now this crisis, right, that we find ourselves in. So I just want to have really a robust conversation around housing, because I think this also speaks to when we talk about this upcoming election in November. The next few weeks, the podcast will really focus on issues that are critical to people and how that connects to November and who we elect in office, whether that's from the city council level all the way up through the federal level, right? That's so important, and we'll talk about that as well. So I just want to have a conversation around, first, we'll say local, and then I want to extend this conversation out, more broadly. And this is a very free-flowing podcast. It's not stiff and stuffy. We're just going to kind of flow with it. I'll throw some questions out there to get us started. But I want to start with you, Councilman Thomas, because one of the things everybody may not know is that the city of Dallas did perform a housing equity audit. So can you just tell us, why did the city do that, and what were some of the key findings and recommendations?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me as one of your first guests. Glad to be with my brother Rob's over there, and thank you for all your hard work you do for the community and how you organize. As far as the racial equity audit, how it came about is I was appointed chair in January 2021, And I wanted to sit down and have a real frank, open conversation with our housing department staff to see where we are, what were priorities as we were changing leadership from our Mayor Pro Tem, Chad West, to myself. And so as we began to have conversations, the one thing that was not taken into consideration when we created the comprehensive housing policy was the racial impacts on the policy and how people who live and historically lived in Black and brown communities would be impacted by that policy. And so once the audit, the consultants did the audit, it came back with some findings that most of us who've lived or worked or served in the southern part of the city already knew, that historically we've implemented policies that have hurt Black people. And so the first step was to identify what those policies are, and then to make recommendations on how we can not only remove those policies, put policies in place that are going to help Black people and help brown people and focus on generational wealth. And we know home ownership is the first step to our generational wealth. And so they came back with 11 recommendations, and the council voted unanimously 15-0 to accept all of the 11 recommendations. And the city manager's even gone forward so far as to say, based on this information, we're going to completely create a whole new housing policy with a focus on racial equity. And so we're getting ready to start the process with the vision statement, and then we'll go from there. But I mean, a lot of hard work. Edwin played a significant part in that, as well as others, Pastor Haynes, yourself, from the beginning. And so now the hard part starts, which is getting rid of the old policy and having the community, because the consultant said it needed to be community-led. The community leads the process of developing this new policy.
I'm glad you said it. So, Reverend Edwin, Councilman Thomas just mentioned, and I remember one of the recommendations was that this has to be a community-driven process, right? So talk to me about why it's important to be a community-driven process, and two, how do we really, I think we already have the power, right? But how do we allow people not to give their agency away and to make sure it's a community-driven process and we don't default back into doing what we do, right?
Absolutely. So first, just thank you for allowing me to be here, Reverend Ayers, in Fannie Lou's classroom. Y'all, this is an amazing space. Good to be with my brother, my Phi Casey Thomas, and all the ladies that put this together. Thank you for inviting brothers to be your first guests. We appreciate that. But definitely, as it relates to it being a community-driven process, I think at the end of the day, right, one thing that we know is that council members serve 2-year terms, right? Have to get elected every 2 years, and our mayor serves a 4-year term. And I think at the end of the day, the issues that are plaguing our community, we know, based on their own reports, right? We're saying that these policies go back to Civil War era, right? And so what that means is that cycle after cycle after cycle after cycle of city leadership has sat in place knowing that these are the issues, right? The consultants also said that there have been over 60 plans that have been written, over 160 plans, that have been written over the last 6 decades. That's 60 years, right? That articulate some of these same realities. So that lets us to know that our city leadership, if they're the ones who are responsible for carrying this forward and owning this process, that we will be back here 10 years from now, 5 years from now, 60 years from now. The only way that we are going to actually see the kind of change that we want to see in our communities is if every policy, every idea, every concept comes deeply from the community in particular. And even more so, and appreciate the consultants, because they actually did really good work. I'm a consultant myself, right? And I pride myself on doing good work as a consultant.
Right.
Nevertheless, as a consultant, I'm always clear that the work that I did is not the work that has to get done. It is going to take our city officials, our city leaders, our community leaders going to the community, not expecting the community to come to us, to come to them. For us to drive this process and ensure that the structure, the resources are put in place, that community leaders in a transgenerational, that's a word that I learned from you, Reverend Ayers, in a transgenerational way, that 20 years from now, the children who are sitting in the room are leading the process 20 years from now, whether they are in city government or whether they are just working a job, right, at the local whatever space, right, but we are leading this process into the next 5, 6, 10 decades.
Yeah, I'm gonna come back to that, but I'm gonna come back to that point about, because we will also think it's important for us to talk to people who are listening who just may be at home and they see this crisis, they know it has to be done. What can I do practically, right? We go back to Fannie Lou Hamer, right? It was this idea of, well, how is this livable, right? How does this show up in everyday life? But I want to put a pin to come back to you, Councilman Thomas. So we talk about community-driven process. How do you, because somewhere there has to be, still a gap between community and government, right? So, and the big gap is accountability. So, right, so if it's going to be a community-driven process, right, what is that? So you laid out what that looks like, right? What elements need to be in play? But then the question becomes, who at the city, as the community comes and says, because the way I see it, it should be more of the community says, here's the plan, right? And city council says, okay, let's look at it. We need to adopt this plan. And as Edwin has said, where you sit, those seats rotate. So how do we make sure it's deeply embedded? The same way the race-based policies have been deeply embedded, how do we now have, race-based policies that are positive, that correct the wrong, really reparations, right? It's like, because they said 150 years of race-based policies created this. So where's the accountability? How do you move it from the council level to make sure it's actually part of the structure? Because it's the structure also that's dysfunctional at the city level. So what would you say?
Well, I think we were off to a good start a few years ago, actually before COVID, with the Public Policy Committee and the work that the Public Policy Committee was doing, because the Public Policy Committee had a voice. It may not have been as large as voice we would have liked, because I was at a lot of the meetings and part of it when we voted on the comprehensive housing policy originally. And probably if some of those things that the policy committee suggested would have been included, we wouldn't be where we are now. We wouldn't be looking at the fact that we didn't have a racial equity focus on that. But I think it's important, as this new policy is developed, that the community is at the table, that it's a joint process, and I think developing even potentially a draft. And me and you've talked about this, Danielle, the community has to do the hard work of studying, of doing the research, of putting together, presenting models, because it's easy to come down and say what isn't being done, but to bring something to the table. I give you a good example. When we did the Community Police Oversight Board, changed from a review board to a Community Police Oversight Board. It wasn't the city that led that effort. It was a community oversight coalition that came to us and said, hey, here are policies and here's a strategy that Atlanta and several other cities have implemented, and we'd like to see that happen here in the city of Dallas. And so we've got to have a true partnership. And the role that's critically important is, you hit it, accountability. The community has to be able to hold the council, the city manager, the mayor accountable for implementing what the community wants to see come out of this process. I must admit, I was pleasantly surprised that the consultants came back with, did the deep research in terms of the historical impacts of what's happened here in the city of Dallas, in making their recommendations. But that's the type of work that has to take place. And I thought it was really impressive that the consultants, when we had our first town hall meeting to discuss the draft of the recommendations, and Edwin was there and he spoke and he made several points, and I believe they included some of those in their recommendation before they came to the full council for the briefing. It was important for them to say, okay, what's your vision? To the community, those who were present. And we had all intentions of actually going to the community with the meetings, but because of COVID, we had to do things a little bit different. But I think those who came down to City Hall and actually gave their input, and that input made a tremendous difference because it made those recommendations that much better.
If
I may,
yes.
I mean, I agree, but I want to shift that language just a little bit, right? Because I hear what you're saying, but I don't think it's that the community needs to be at the table. I think it's that the council needs to be at the table where the community is, not the other way around. And I say that because based on the very recommendations that the consultants put down, the people who they talked to, one of the top line things said the community fundamentally does not trust city government.
Absolutely.
And that's not, and that's a very well earned trust, right? When you look at 100+ years, right, and over 100 plans that have been put, and no one has actually done anything with them, right? I would even go so far as to say exactly what you suggested: the community come together, put down suggestions, and bring it to the council. Well, over the last 5 years, we've done just that. There was a group that came together, Our City, Our Future, right, who put together a comprehensive plan that they went through multiple city community meetings. Some were held right here at Friendship West. I was a part of them.
Right.
Where we talked with the community. They came up with suggestions. These are the things that we want to see moved in the city. Not only did they come up with suggestions, even put a dollar amount next to it. This is exactly how much it's going to cost. Came to the city council, put it in front of the city council, organized the people, showed up to city council meetings, organized the people, showed up to city council briefings. And then when the budget season came, everybody, the entire council, I was there, I was a part, I was texting you and others. Everybody kind of ignored it and passed a budget that did not respect the realities of what the community put forward. I'll even go with even another step forward. Myself, along with a number of clergy leaders and community, put together a plan that would meet infrastructure needs, particularly in the southern sector, while helping Black institutions maintain and grow assets, right? Multiple meetings that we put that in front of every city council person, the mayor, city manager, all the staff, and there was silence, there was nothing, right? And so I absolutely agree with you that, yes, the community does need to take responsibility and accountability, but I would go so far as to say, in my recent history, the community has done just that, brought those things to city council and have gotten nothing. But it seems like when the city council or the city is driving the process, now all of a sudden things can roll. And I think that goes antithetical to the actual point that the consultants laid out of it being a community-driven process, not a city-driven process. And that's the move that we're going to have to flip.
Yeah, and I think it even goes to, I think you mentioned that now is is developing the vision plan. So the vision statement should come from the community, right? So how is that process? So is the community engaged in that? Like, and who? I guess it's not just community when we say that, because sometimes that means certain people, right? It's not the people who are most impacted who should have their voices amplified. So I'm just wondering who is being included to craft this vision statement, but also back to what you're saying, Edwin, in terms of the work has been done on the community side. But I'm also, so I want, if you can answer that question, Edwin, I also want to ask you, how do we also, though, how can we continue to bring people into this process and have them stay, right? Because that's also that's also a challenge too, right? Because to Councilman's point, this is hard work, and so you referenced the public policy committee that we started here at Friendship West, right? That we led with several people. It was citywide. It was people not just from Friendship West. It was, I mean, even policy experts who are part of this. But part of why it broke down, right, and kind of disseminates because the city never really responded, and some of what we put forth as recommendations, as you know, they took some of those recommendations. And we were not even, asked about it. We didn't know it had happened. We did that work, and it was not just it wasn't acknowledged, but it was as if the work we put into the research, because you said we should research. And so to do that, right, and it goes back to that trust, which continues to break the trust of the people, right? So and I wanted to let me just stay on topic a little bit. So if you can answer who's involved in crafting that vision statement, and if you could talk about, yes, the community is doing the work, and talk about how do we get people to continue to stay there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, I mean, the timing is perfect, and, it was going to be part of my commercial at the end. So we're getting ready to start a series of in the community meetings to craft a vision statement to get the community's input. So on June 14th, and this will be in the community, we're going to be at Nash Davis Recreation Center in West Dallas. On the 16th, we're going to be at Juanita Craft, which is in South Dallas Fair Park. And then on, I believe it's and I'll confirm, I believe it's the 23rd. Yes, we'll be at Thurgood Marshall Recreation Center. So originally, these are locations we were going to go and host the meetings at when we to share with the community, get their input on the recommendations. But because of COVID, we had to move them to City Hall. So now we're going back to those same locations. And so we have the flyer if you want to, post it on wherever we need to post it, because we want to make sure people that live in each of those communities know about the meetings,
Right.
have an opportunity. It's the second. We had 12 days before the first one that's in West Dallas, 14 days before the one that's in South Dallas, and almost 21 days before the one that's going to be in Oak Cliff. And so we want to make sure, everyone who wants to have a say in this process knows that they can, and then we'll have other means for them also to give input. If they're not able to make the meetings, then we'll, provide a way for people to give input on what they think should be a part of this vision statement, because the vision statement is critically important. That's the first recommendation that the consultants came back with, because it sets the tone, it sets the atmosphere, and it says who we as a city of Dallas are when it comes to housing and providing housing.
So, and how do you close that loop? So it's inviting people to come out, which I think is good, right? Where I can come out and talk about what my vision is. And so once you, I'm sure, craft and have this, this draft of a vision statement, how do you plan to get that back out to those same people so they can see, I gave my input, the input was in these different areas. Out of all of what people had to say, here's what we're proposing as a draft. And how do people give that feedback, right, to say, well, that's kind of what I was going after. That sounds right for community. So how is that process going to go? You have the meeting,
Right.
then.
Well, we want to make sure that we have, of course, with COVID, we saw the importance of technology, but everybody doesn't just have access to technology. We want to look at, whatever means of communication we can. Recommendations, because the city has not done a good job of communicating with the community. They haven't. We think we can put it in the water bill and that, most people just take the bill out and throw everything else in the trash. So we've got to look at, non-traditional and traditional means of getting information out to individuals. So we're open to recommendations on how, as we collect this information, we can make it available to the community, and they have, a say in terms of what it is, because, of course, it's going to be the council that makes the final decision. But we want to make sure that the community's voice is involved from the beginning all the way to the end.
Right. So I want to pivot to come back to that, because I think that's something, as we know, as organizers, as those who, and so you're Councilman now. When I met you, you were on the front lines with me. So we all know what it means to be in this struggle for justice, peace, love, and liberation, right? That it's as Angela Davis said, it's a constant struggle. Freedom, right, is a constant struggle. And yeah, just talk to us about that challenge, because that's what's going to be important. I think if this is going to be a community-driven process, community has to stay engaged, right? So yeah, talk to us about that.
Yeah, so I think that there are a number of things that have to happen for the community to stay engaged in the process, right? We have to have multiple levels of engagement, and it has to be consistent. We have to be, it has to be everything from surveys to phone banking to convening people to meeting people where they are to consistently giving people information and all those things. But I'm going to say what I think is more important than those things that I just mentioned, which are important, is that the convener is important. And if the conveners are not trusted sources, then the people who are going to show up to the convening are not going to be the people who we are not going to be, let me not say that, are not going to be all of the people or a great majority of the people that we need to hear from. And I think when I think about, because, I'm a consultant as well, as I said before, but most of it's around strategy and strategy of how do we connect with people and how do we keep people engaged, right? And I think at the end of it, like when we're looking, I go back to the recommendations of the consultants, right? I go back to that top line recommendation that jumps out to me. They don't trust the city, right? So if the community doesn't trust the city, then how can the city then lead a process that will bring people in to be able to give input that could then go into a set of recommendations, right? That doesn't seem to jive. It doesn't seem to follow. It would follow, in my estimation, right, that there are trusted people in the city who have been doing this work, who then the city says, hey, we know in the same way that the city went out and paid very good money to an outside consultant, right, to come in and give these recommendations, it would make sense to me that the city would then convene those leaders who have been doing this work on a consistent basis, say, here's a set of resources. Can you all, we're gonna take our hand and let you all draft the process. And when that process is drafted, we are going to enter into that process without equivocation, without pushback, without our ideas, because we trust and believe that you all have been doing this longer than we've been sitting on the council. That sort of process, I believe, will create community trust and respect, and then allow us to move a process further, faster, longer, keeping people engaged, versus the city attempting to go out and drive a process when the community has already said they don't trust that the city's going to do anything with it.
Yeah, and I think there's two things. I think that's that's part of it, and the other part, as we mentioned before, and we often talk about, that the process has to also be transgenerational, right?
Absolutely.
That because I go back to Dudley Street. We've talked about Dudley Street before in Boston, and how, that was decades ago, but how the community still thrives. And it's because they went to the city with the plan laid out, right? And the city of Boston was like, bet. Here's what we're going to do. But they also they were clear about the Declaration of Rights, like what's going to happen and what's not going to happen in this space for us to flourish. And to your point, it's still flourishing now because those young children were actually at the table in the room. They may not have been talking, but they may have been in the corner. They're hearing the process. They're understanding how politics works. Yep. They're understanding what it means not to give your agency over to your elected officials, right? It's how you work in tandem, right? So with that being the case, I happen to agree with Edwin on that point, right? That how can the city perhaps take a different posture, I guess, in this process and really be able to, because the city, like, plenty of people in the community who are very well trusted, who really have served, quite faithfully, right? Who people can look to and say, okay, I'll be a part of that process. In fact, I'll be a part and I'll stay engaged, right? And so I guess it can be both of you. How do we create this collaborative work? What needs to happen? Like practically, what needs to happen?
Yeah, I'll start. I think the first practical step is that, and I actually said this at the city council meeting, I think the first practical step is that the city needs to apologize. Like, the whole city needs to apologize. Quite literally, this document says, since the Civil War. Right. Literally, the city of Dallas has historically, intentionally, and perpetually defunded every single area where black people live. And then we can talk about our brown sisters and brothers, right? But so the first thing is apologize. The second thing is repent. That means I acknowledge the wrong, and we are going to turn from our ways, which have been quite literally wicked by definition, right?
Come on.
Not by indictment, but by definition, quite literally wicked. We're going to turn from our wicked ways, and we're going to try something new. Maybe something new sounds like, I don't know, I have a trusted group of people who have been doing this for a very long time, and we, the city, are going to say, no, we are going to resource them to go and actually do the work that they've been doing on a shoestring budget.
Right.
And we're going to resource them to convene the people, to create a plan, to create a strategy. And then once that has been done, the city is going to sit and listen and then say, no, we're going to adopt these practices and figure out how to make them work in the context of the civics, right, which are a very particular thing. I think that if we take those steps, right, then we're actually we can have a city that's a shining light that sits upon a hill.
Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. And I think when we need, for your listening audience, those especially who live in Dallas, there are two different things that are going on at the same time. One is we're in the process of implementing recommendations from the Racial Equity Audit to create a new housing policy. The other thing is we're literally doing a citywide racial equity
Right.
plan,
Right.
which is going to include economic development. It's going to include infrastructure. It's going to include all the public safety and the intent. And if that has not happened, I'm not driving that process. I'm vice chair. I'm not chair of that committee. But if the intent of the process is not working the way it was intended, then we need to see what's going on, because the consultant, who's an African-American male consultant company, Conspero Consulting, the intent was not to pre-bake the cake. The intent has been to meet with those trusted voices in the community. If those things haven't happened, then we need to have a conversation with the consultant, because they're doing good work internally in terms of meeting with the departments, include having those directors to put together performance measures or goals for their department that includes a racial equity focus, which has never been done before. But externally, it's important as well that we get feedback and input, not just on what those performance measures should look like, but what a actual racial equity plan from the community's point of view should be. And so I'm not sure if those conversations have taken place. I know, you shared with me that, some miscommunication. I don't know if that's been fixed or not.
It has not.
Okay. All right. All right. So I got an assignment when I leave, because those trusted voices, you said, need to be a part of not only just the process of creating a new housing policy, but definitely need to be a part of this citywide racial equity plan.
If I may,
Sure,
if
yes.
I may, I mean, so I want to make a distinction, right? There's a consulting firm that has been hired from the city to do this comprehensive racial equity
Yeah, a
audit.
local consulting firm, actually.
And then there's a consultant firm that was hired to give the recommendations. I want to make sure that I want to be clear. Those are
right.
two different
Absolutely.
consulting
Right.
firms.
Right.
Now, you were very clear, and the only reason I'm going to bring this up is because you mentioned it, right? That it's a black male who is running the Cospero, the consulting firm, is doing the. But let's be clear that the great majority of their staff is not people of color.
Okay.
The great majority of their staff is white. So yes, there is a black face at the top, but the majority of the staff is white. And I want to make that distinction, right? Not only that, and this is not a dig on the consulting firm, right? This is actually, I'll go back to say this. That wasn't an organization, right, who is trusted consistently by the very people who are most directly impacted by this study. So even the city choosing this particular consulting firm, right, to do a racial equity audit is a little bit suspect. And I'll
The audit or the plan?
the racial equity
Racial
audit,
equity, the overall city.
the overall city audit, right? Because
No, it's a plan. It's development of a plan. As
okay,
opposed
so
to an audit of the policy.
nevertheless, to develop a plan, that's even worse, I think. But I would go, and I would take it a step further, right, to even say that the person that I believe, her name escapes me as soon as I try to think of it, that I believe will be responsible for even executing that plan, who the city just hired, is a white woman, in my understanding. Now, this is not to say that white people cannot have empathy or sympathy or understand the needs, but it is to say that the information in this document says that it is black folk who are experiencing the greatest tragedies, right, as in the city. And so I guess I'm not understanding why the group that was brought together wasn't majority black, and why I'm also not understanding why the person who's going to be responsible for carrying out the plan is not also black. I mean, these things are
just for
confusing.
clarification, when you say the person, are you talking the staff member?
Yes.
She's black.
Okay, because I was
Dr. Lindsay Wilson. She's the new
okay.
director.
So she's going to be carrying forward.
Right.
Thank you so much for
Yeah.
that. That makes me feel good.
Yeah,
Thank you.
but also to your point too, right? In terms of when the city hires consultants, et cetera. So yeah, representation is important, but it's also the right representation.
The right representation, say it.
Because we also know, right, that white supremacy that continues to undergird a lot of these systems, institutions, black faces sit in high places. So it's not just black, but what kind of black person is. And I've worked with Dr. Lindsay, and so far my interactions with her has been wonderful. And I think it's about, again, it goes back to how we don't give over our power and agency. How do we keep them tracking? But to your point, I think a lot of work still has to be done in terms of the city being willing to do something totally different. To your point, to repent and turn away from the ways in which Dallas is used to operating. And we have to continue to keep our foot on the necks of the city to do that, the people. Right. So now I want to shift from, because we kind of been talking more of a place of privilege, right, in terms of structures and what we need to do. But I want to talk about people who can't do this. Like, they out working hard right now, 2 and 3 jobs, have to live outside the city because they can't afford rent, can't buy a home. So let's talk about, it's one thing to have housing to be accessible. That is, oh, we have these apartments over here. It's another thing for it to be affordable. That's right. So how are we defining affordability? When the city talks about affordable housing, what is that? What is that? Because I know that's various pressure points for different cities and different people. So for the city of Dallas, what is that up and against, right, the medium income? Right.
So affordable is, for the city of Dallas, is 60 to 80% of area median income, which is probably between $45,000 and I would say $65,000. So when we talk about, and then you have, what they call 0 to 50%, which is individuals who, on the complete other end of the spectrum. And so it's a fine, it's a balancing act, because you got, black NIMBYs, not in my backyard. Then you got, white NIMBYs. You got people who feel like, I don't want them living close to me or living near me. Well, who is them? And so we're in the process, and this is a part of the recommendations of actually creating a campaign where we go around and we have discussions about what is the face of affordable housing and how do you perceive that person to be. There was a community meeting when somebody said, I don't want drug dealers and prostitutes. And we're talking about people who are working, making $45,000 to maybe $65,000 a year. But the perception is, in a lot of communities, that this person is a drug dealer, a prostitute, or something of that nature, or they're homeless. And so, that's really, challenging, because you have to be willing to have political courage. And all this is about political courage. At the end of the day, this is what the whole discussion is about. You have to have political courage to say, you know what, everyone deserves a place to live. Everyone deserves the quality of life that they can, raise a family and grow and prosper. And our job is to create, space for that, irrespective of race, ethnicity, sexual, all those other things.
Yeah, because I was going to say drug dealers, prostitutes, whatever you want to, how you want to label them, everybody deserves a right to have safety in housing, right? Because without housing, that just is another way of structural violence, right, that people then are subjected to. And so I hear what you're saying, because I know people who make $65,000, maybe $70,000 a year, and they can't afford rent in the city. Right. So I'm trying to, I really want to understand what is the city, and then Edwin, I want you to respond from our preview, those on the outside of the city, what we can do, because I'm very concerned. Even in my neighborhood, I turn a corner, housing that was there is completely gone, and $500,000 homes are going up. So while we're kind of going back and forth, people are being pushed out, which means they're being disconnected from systems that they know. Perhaps my babysitter is 2 blocks away. My job is maybe 5 minutes away. Now I have to live in maybe a first, second ring suburb. And so I'm, as many Fuller would say, I'm experiencing root shock, right? Everything that I know that's familiar to me is now being disrupted because I can't afford to live here. So I'm really, really concerned about what are we going to do now. We have a plan. This is a process we're talking about, but what is going to happen in the interim? Because while we're processing, meeting, getting a vision statement, people are losing housing. Right. So I'm just. So you can answer it, and we can talk about it. Let me say
this, and I'm seeing it. I'm seeing it, and I'm aware of it, and because sensitized to it, I'm in a position to where if there's any impact the city can have, I want to make sure the city does. I'm having a conversation with our housing director now, who has to be an African-American male, have a conversation with him now about what can we do dealing with this challenge of affordability and bring me something. Is there anywhere in other cities, where they're actually coming up with ways to, bring down, these prices? And so I'm actively looking for, models that we can implement if possible here in the city of Dallas.
And the other thing I'm concerned about are, even in our area, particularly in Oak Cliff, where you have what I would be like my parents' age, right? Our parents who may be aging in their homes with taxes going up. The house is paid for, but they can't afford the taxes, which means they'll probably lose the house, which then it's gentrified, right? Then they come in, and how you have, developers literally taking over blocks.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering what's the buffer going to be?
I don't know how good of a job we did of explaining to people the two constitutional amendments that was just on the ballot in May. Many people say, well, it's not a council race, it's not a mayor race, so I'm not going to vote. Those constitutional amendments were to give, some relief to seniors in particular. We did it, here in Dallas, and we're looking at ways in which we can, continue to do this and increase it to where our seniors have some type of relief. And another is tax freezes, and making sure that not only we know as far as those who, are part of the city council or those who are city staff, but the community knows that these strategies are available that we can use to put a freeze on taxes in certain, homestead exemptions in certain neighborhoods that where those homeowners, especially those who've lived there 30, 40 years, are not impacted as the taxes increase and there's growth and development that cause those increases in those neighborhoods.
Go ahead.
I think that all these tools, as I've been working with the city for a number of years now, I've known that all these tools existed. I'm going to go back to something that you actually said, political courage and political will. And there is an extreme, if political courage is needed, then again, based on fact, not on indictment, I would then say that our council has political cowardice, right? Because that would be the opposite of courage, am I right?
You're on target.
Okay. So I'm just saying what I've seen is if I'm looking at the stats again from the report, 53.2% of our white sisters and brothers in this city have home ownership. 41.4% of our Latinx sisters and brothers in this city have home ownership. 28.5% of black people in this city have home ownership, right? And so if that is real, if that is the reality, and then let's add into that reality, we're talking about affordability, right? So we're talking about 50 to 60% of AMI?
60 to 80.
60 to 80% of AMI, right? Well, then I'm talking to my developer friends, right? And they're very clear with inflation, they can't even build a house, right? That would actually be affordable in that context. Well, then how does the city help with that?
Exactly.
There's a whole program. Would you believe it, Reverend Ayers? There's a whole program where the city can actually put money into and offer low income who are at that 60 to 80 AMI, offer them the gap between what they actually qualify for in AMI and what the actual house costs based upon, and can actually fill that gap. We're offering, I think, 60 or 70, we can move that up to 80, 90, $100,000 per borrower. As a matter of fact, the city has $300 million in ARP funds that have yet to be spent. And none of that money has been spent to actually meet the needs of the housing crisis. If it is true that the city has intentionally, perpetually, and historically defunded black people everywhere we're located, it would then also be true that black people have had the worst health effects and determinants of health based upon that redlining and defunding, which would then also make it true that the effects of COVID hit the black community harder than any other community, which would then only make sense that the great majority of any American Rescue Plan federal dollars that come in to address and mitigate the harm on COVID go directly to black people. Not because I'm black, simply, but because that's just the facts.
And it's dealing with because see, that also causes soul trauma and woundedness, right? And that has to be corrected, and that can be both in healing, like mentally and emotionally, but it could also be financially.
Come on.
Right. And so I remember D Magazine not so long ago did a whole article when you talk about that home ownership and the way the city and others, took people's land in South Dallas, paid them pennies, right? Intentionally stripped. And, Rothstein, a couple years ago, we did a whole thing around Rothstein, right? The color of law. So we know it's there. Yep. And to your point, the question becomes, why hasn't the money been moved?
And I'm even going to go a bit further, right? And the city of Dallas has a way of doing things that the consultants, again, I go back to their recommendations because they put it in there. They said we can't have this peanut butter approach. Where we say we take the money and we spread it across to everybody because I say this at the risk of alienating or even offending some of my brown sisters and brothers, but I'm okay with that because we cool and we can talk about it after this podcast is over. But I'm gonna be very clear that the stats say what they say.
That's it, right?
And what they say is black people are the most directly impacted by the city's intentionality, right, against harming folk, which means that there is anything that happens, any money that's moved needs to go to black people first. And then we have a conversation about our brown sisters and brothers. Then we have a conversation about everybody else. And if someone if someone doesn't like that, I dig it. But everywhere I've been in Dallas, every meeting I've been in, Casey, I know you've been there, Reverend Air, everybody's always talking about show me the data, show me the data, show me the data.
Right.
Well, this is what the data says, right? And has always said. So if there's $300 million in federal money, $200 million of that needs to go to black people, and then we need to figure out what to do with the rest, right? If there's more federal dollars that come down, this needs to go to immediately putting money in black people's pockets so that black people can afford homes, so that black people can build wealth, so that we can mitigate and remedy and repent and turn from the since Civil War era wickedness of this city.
And let's be clear, we have numerous accounts where other groups have been given reparations for harm that has been caused to them.
Numerous.
And it has not been over the course of centuries in this country, the harm and damage that has been done. So I thank you for bringing that up because I just think those are the facts, right? And the question has become, if you have a problem doing that, then that's the deeper issue, right? It is whiteness, and I'm saying whiteness is a political and social construct to continue to maintain the power like y'all can't have it. Because it's telling you right there what has been done, right? And the proof is right there. So why, I guess the question becomes, why has, particularly, even black folks at the city level where the city council who work there, city manager, why this, that should be an immediate thing was like, well, we see this, well, then we immediately need to come up with how we begin to move this money, right? And that's always an issue. That's the issue I have. And then on our side as community folks, like, what do we need to do? How does this free us? How does...
Yeah, I think that we have to organize ourselves, and I know that always sounds like I was sitting with some, a sister yesterday and a pastor yesterday, and I was like, we got to organize ourselves. They were like, but what do we have to do? I said, no, we have to organize ourselves, right? I said, no, it's actually that simple, right? Now, organizing is hard, but the answer is simple,
right?
Right? We have to organize ourselves to be able to hold city and hold government accountable, right? And that's just the bottom line. Right, and we have to be able to, and we have to use every mode of power that there is to hold city accountable and hold our political officials accountable. Like we're willing to, I'm part of a group of clergy, and we've been willing to use every tactic on the table, whether it is sitting down and just having a conversation, whether it's just having a meeting, whether it's disrupting an event to get people's attention, right? Whether it's organizing the people to show up, we're going to have to do all those things to keep people focused. And I think the other thing is if we're going to have political officials who are going to sit in the seat and say, we got to have people who are champions for our people. I mean, your district, it's predominantly black, right? It ain't predominantly black and brown. It's black, right? There's brown people there, absolutely, right? But it's black, right? And so we need city council people who are in black districts to be sitting on the council advocating for black people, not having these ridiculous conversations about all these other, because it's our people that are being hurt. And I want to lay this last little just statistically, right? So 41.1% of Dallasites identify as ethnically Hispanic. Ethnically. 41.1%. But 76.7% of that group racially identify as white. Right? So that means 3/4 of the people in this city who ethnically identify as Hispanic racially identify as white. I'm saying that because black people don't get that ability.
Right.
We racially, ethnically, and everything black.
Yeah.
And so we need black council people, black mayors, black county leaders, black sheriffs, black DAs, black people who are sitting in this seat to understand that their responsibility, yes, is to the city, but it is to the least of these in the city. And who have been made to be the least of these? Well, this report says since the Civil War, it's been black folk.
So I'll give you one last word as we wrap this segment up before we move into our last segment.
No problem. And looking at stats, and we're in the process of going through redistricting, and based on the 2020 census, we have one black majority council district. And simply based on population. Now, voting age population is a little bit different, but population, District 8 is the only one that's majority African American. However, the points, that you made, I haven't refuted any point, because if it was incorrect, I would. Those that were debatable, I pointed out. I think at this point, what we have to do is we have to see where the gaps are. And when I say we'll see where the gaps are, the intent is to make sure that every voice is heard. But if there is some skepticism on behalf of those who are represented by the community, then every voice won't be a part of the discussion. And so we have to make sure that we identify what those gaps are and fill those gaps by people who are trusted voices, and find a way in order to build a relationship. One last thing, when we had this discussion about implementing the recommendation, it passed 15-0. However, there was some discussion about the fact that we talk good now, but when it's budgeting time,
Right.
something else happens. So the true question is, when we come back from recess in August and September, because we have a commitment from the city manager, he's going to put together a equity-focused budget that expands the pie. And so the question is, one, how much of the pie will be included? Two, whatever part of that pie that is included, will the political will be there from the council? Give you a real simple example. Councilmember Parlor said this: it's 4 Hispanic council members. No, it's 4 black, 5 Hispanic. That's 9. That's majority. We got the votes. One would just do what we need to do. And so I'll leave it at that.
So yeah, I'll leave it because this conversation obviously is loaded and very layered, right? But I thought it was important to start the conversation to let people know what's out there. And so if people just stay tuned to Family Lose Classroom, we'll talk about the ways in which you can engage. And on the community side, Reverend Edwin Robinson and I are working on some things, and we'll be inviting you to be a part of that. So we'll conclude this segment. And what I wanted to do with Family Lose Classroom, because it is designed to deal with like a lot of heavy issues, right? Intense issues at times. When I was growing up, some of my family members in our community, they had these places called sitting rooms or parlors. Right. And so it was a place where, grown folks would go, maybe sip on something, smoke, just have general, it could be, about philosophy. It could be about anything. Right. But it was designed to be relaxed and just be in community. So I always want to take time out of the classroom to kind of come down from the tense conversation, just talk. Right. So this is very, unscripted, laid back. So let's enter into this parlor. Right. So let's just learn more about you as men. So what do you do for fun? And give us something about you that people may not know about. Because, both of you have very intense jobs, right? Vocations. But we're more than our vocations, right? We are well-rounded people. So give me something about you that nobody knows. And what do you enjoy doing for fun?
Am I first? You're looking at me, so I guess I'm first. Man, so what do I do for fun? The truth is, what I do for fun is like hang out with my friends.
Yeah.
Like, I do this movement work, and I got like family and comrades and colleagues in this movement work. But my friends, they don't do this. They just regular black folk doing regular black folk jobs, right?
Right, we need that.
You know what I
We
mean?
need that.
And so, like I got back from Buffalo, and I went to my friend's brunch, and, I told my friends I was going. They were praying for me and praying with me. But then I got back, walked in. They were like, Edwin, how is Buffalo? I said, I'm here, and I don't want to talk about it. They said, all right. And we moved right on. Right. And we had a good time, right? So I think that's what I do for fun. Something that people don't know about me. I have I did this count the other day. I have 26 great nieces and nephews.
Wow.
Right? So, yep, I'm black, and my family black, and I'm the youngest of a black family. If y'all know what that means.
Yeah.
Okay. So, my mother had some children. My dad had some kids. They got married, and then I was born. And my dad was 18 years older than my mother. So I got 26 great nieces and nephews.
Wow.
And that's important for me. It's because, in these moments sometimes where it feels like such despair, and like they give me so much hope. And I can wake up even though I don't have my own children, I can wake up every morning and think about them to do my work.
Amen. That's beautiful, though. I mean, that's really beautiful. What about you, Casey?
Yeah. What I do for fun, I love sports. I love old school music, R&B.
Okay.
And, jazz. And so, just sitting around with friends, same thing, and just, might have a cup.
Come on.
You know how we all like to jump
joy
in the church.
and health.
There you go. Absolutely.
Let's always jump in the
Absolutely.
church. Jesus turned water into wine. It's all good.
That's right. And just, what people don't know about me is I'm really a shy person. I have to be, when I was president of NAACP.
I didn't know that, and I've been knowing you for 20 years.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm a very shy person. I really am.
Okay.
But the calling has required me to be more outspoken and more outgoing. But absolutely, core who I am, I'm a shy person.
Okay.
I used to go to the party and stand on the wall and watch everybody.
I used the wildflower until you started shimmying.
I'm about to say, come on now.
It brings it out of
you. ain't got no choice.
Yeah, it brought it out.
Brought it out.
You ain't got no choice.
Brought it out. Okay, so last thing then, who's going to take game one tonight?
I got Boston game one.
You know what? My heart is with Boston, but my head is with Golden State.
Look, I think Golden State's going to win the series, but I got Boston game one.
So, yeah.
Good. So I'm neutral. I'm going to go Golden State only because, I'm a long-time Laker fan, right? Back with James Worthy, Michael Cooper, Kareem, my father and I, we connected over sports, right? So that's how I got, and so whatever team he liked back in the day, that's what I like. So I was like in elementary, like, go Lakers, go Lakers. So that Boston thing, right? It's real. So
and then also my thing is, look, I've been a Duke fan since I was in like 7th grade, and so like I got my man Tatum.
Yeah,
he ain't getting swept, and I got him coming out the gate.
Did you know he's our Grandpa Mark's grandson?
I did not know that.
He is.
Well,
He is.
even more. This is so.
Yes.
Let's go Tatum.
Absolutely.
Let's go Duke.
And that's
Let's
Neil
go
Lone's
Duke.
boost. So I'm gonna go. I may be out. Maybe out. Maybe I'll stay neutral.
You can get one tonight. You can get one tonight.
Because he's not gonna get all of them. So listen, thank you so much, Reverend Edwin Robinson, Councilman Casey Thomas, my dear friends, for being my first guest. I'm so excited to have had this conversation with you and get to know more about you. Hey, listen, make sure you tell everyone about Fannie Lou's Classroom. Like us on Facebook, like us on Instagram, subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're super excited about next week. We'll be back here at 12 o'clock. And next week, we'll talk about an issue around healthcare, where we will have a healthcare professional, really both things. She is both a CEO of healthcare systems, but she also really understands, here it is, Edwin, what it means to be a Black woman and the lack of care and access that we have, even if you're educated, have money, right? So she's going to really talk about the importance of healthcare and what we need to do to be more, have more agency over our healthcare, right? And demand more of our healthcare systems, and also build alternative ways in which we can care for ourselves. So we have Cheryl Prelow with us next week at 12 o'clock. Make sure you join us next week right here in Fannie Lou's classroom. And I want to leave you with a quote by Fannie Lou Hamer as we get ready to close out. And this is what Fannie Lou Hamer, our ancestor who is still with us, says: you can pray until you faint, but if you don't get up and try to do something, God is not going to place it in your lap. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you back here in class next Thursday at 12 o'clock noon.
From the church house.